Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X, I guess, at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm back after an extended summer break, which I very much needed and appreciated, and I hope you had a wonderful summer as well. During that summer, we've had Twitter change its name to X. The Digital Services Act has gone into effect here in Europe, and a number of papers on Facebook's role in American elections has come out in Nature and Science. So there's a lot of topics to cover in the social media and politics space, and I'll be working on lining up some interviews for the fall. But to kind of ease back into podcasting, what I thought to do here is start with something a little bit more close to home, and that is to cover a research article that I recently published together with Dr. Anamaria Segesten and Duya Bonacci, entitled Reconceptualizing Cross-Cutting Political Expression on Social Media, a case study of Facebook comments during the 2016 Brexit referendum. This is a paper published in Political Communication. There'll be a link to the paper, which is free to read in the episode description if you want to dive into it more in detail. But what I thought I'd do is invite Dr. Dutceac Segesten to the show. Many of you know her from the Year in Review episodes. She is an associate professor in strategic communication at Lund University. And rather than go through the paper front to end, instead what we'll do is have a discussion around kind of the motivations and concepts and really kind of try to contextualize the arguments we're making in this paper, because there's only so much space you have to put things into writing. But there's a lot more that I think is important to think about when it comes to what is political expression on social media. What does it mean when people from different sides of referendum or different sides of the political spectrum meet in a social media space? How does that social media space affect the content and behavior of those conversations and those users? These are all things that we'll talk about in the episode itself. But I realize that may be a bit niche. So to give you a bit of a front loading about what this paper is about, it is basically a data set that we collected before all of the Cambridge Analytica stuff. So we have the content of people's comments if they commented to a Facebook page that was campaigning during the Brexit referendum. So we have about 2 million comments from 350,000 users. And what we were trying to find out in this study, just the very empirical level, is how often are people posting to political opponents' pages? And this is this idea of cross-cutting political expression that we'll talk about more in the episode. Long story short, we find that in fact, Facebook pages are not places for homogenous discussion. There's a lot of cross-cutting expression going on. We quantify it at 29% of the comments in our data set were cross-cutting, meaning they were expressed to an ideological opponent or expressed to a space that is not aligned with one's position on the Brexit referendum. And obviously, Brexit gives us a nice chance to just look at if people are for or against the referendum, rather than breaking down the British multi-party system, which is convenient, but it also helps us provide an initial test of our concept of cross-cutting political expression. But in order to find out whether a comment is cross-cutting or not, we first have to classify users into whether they are pro-Brexit or pro-Remain. And we do that through whether they liked or loved posts on either side of the referendum. So that's kind of an innovation in and of itself. So once we find these cross-cutting comments, what we do is we start coding manually whether they contained a reasoned political argument. And this is a way to kind of separate what is a lot of the junk comments that we have in our data set. And I can tell you that covers all sorts of random categories, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the episode, versus those that are actually stating a position on Brexit and backing it up in terms of what people think, the facts they've read, or their logical reasoning behind why they think users should vote one way or the other. We find 7% of the comments in our data contained a reasoned argument. So one could say roughly about 7% of the comments were of this potentially deliberative quality. And while that may be a low number, what is interesting is that the presence of arguments strongly correlates with whether the comment is cross-cutting or not. So arguments happen when ideological opponents meet online within the context of a specific digital space. In our case, comment fields under a Facebook post. And lastly, we topic model the data set in order to find out what topics people are discussing. We break down those topics, we break down how many of them were spam or copy-pasted comments, and then we look to see how the content differs based on whether someone is posting to their ideological home base or posting into the page of their political opponents. And very briefly, the finding there is that we find the vast majority of cross-cutting comments are left by pro-Brexit users to the pro-Remain page at such a scale that actually over half of the comments on the pro-Remain Facebook page were left by leavers. So the page was essentially hijacked, and what we can see by looking at the content and the topics discussed there is that there was no topic Remainers could discuss by themselves, whereas in the case of the pro-Brexit users, they had this page that was unimpeded by pro-Remainers. They could build a community, and in the absence of having a lot of Remainers coming into their page, the Brexiteers could discuss a lot of topics. There were even a bit of conspiracy, spam posts around the Bilderberg group, but most interestingly, in the absence of Remainers coming into their page, the Brexiteers could coordinate examples of political mobilization, such as bringing a black pen to the voting station to ensure their vote was not manipulated. This was before all the discussion of vote manipulation in the US, but also engaging in forms of connective action like sending leaflets in protest back to the British government. So the argument there is basically cross-cutting expression can matter at a behavioral level because it may have some effects on how people mobilize, and it probably didn't change the outcome of the Brexit referendum, but it does show how thinking about partisans interacting in online spaces does have some implication for how Facebook pages can be used for political mobilization. So much more in the paper. Again, feel free to check out the episode description where you'll find a link to it. And also, if you're more interested in the Brexit side of things, do check out the supplementary material where you'll find a breakdown and description of each individual topic that we found being discussed in these Facebook comments around Brexit. But for us, I think the question was more about thinking, what can Brexit tell us more broadly about political expression, behavior, and cross-cutting interactions on social networks. So without further ado, let me cut to my conversation with Dr. Anamaria Dutceac-Segesten. Again, she is an associate professor in strategic communication at Lund University, and I hope y'all enjoy it. Dr. Dutceac-Segesten, welcome back to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Always a pleasure.
So as I've given the listeners a bit of a heads up into the topic and theories and findings of the paper, I thought we could sit down and kind of go through some things that we thought were both interesting and also provide a bit more context. And I think probably the most logical point to start is political expression. So why don't you start off kind of explaining what political expression is and kind of our approach to it in the paper?
Political expression is more than verbalized opinions. That's what we say in the paper, and this is what I'm going to try to explain more clearly here. In the existing political communication literature that focuses a lot on digital channels of communication, there is an accepted understanding of political expression as words carrying opinions. This is how it has been measured. This is how it's been defined. This is how political ideologies have been assigned as well, by the content of what is being said online.
In a comment, in a tweet.
In a post, as subtitles connected from a video and so on. So text that carries opinions or text that carries elements from which the researcher can derive an opinion. And one of the things that we go back in the political science and sociological literature that deals with non-digital expression is to say words are not encompassing every form of political expression. Looking back at historical patterns of political engagement and mobilization, we see citizens involving themselves in non-verbal political expression. And we think this is the case also in the digital world. In other words, doing something online is a valid form of expression just as much as saying something online. And again, reminder, not just saying something, but expressing an opinion, right? So in our view, we need to be more attuned to different modes of political expression in the social media space, which encompass action or behavior, as well as textual expression beyond opinion itself. These are the theoretical arguments upon which our later operationalization builds on.
Yeah, I just want to kind of stay on this notion because it's so central to the paper. I mean, it's interesting how this idea takes hold, that I need to express and state my political ideology and belief to be counted as a political expression. That doesn't really happen online that much, right? Because when you start getting into conversation with a political opponent or even someone that, think about Facebook comments, which is what we study. Like, if you just took a randomly sampled comment underneath the page of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or whoever, the chance that the person is going to express their political opinion and state it very thoroughly, there's not a good chance that's going to happen if you randomly take a comment. But also in real life too, right? People don't go around and just spout out their political opinions, but they do make political statements that don't necessarily carry all this information about what they believe, but it's still political.
And this is one element that I think our particular approach brings new to the table, but may be beneficial for others. Namely, our approach takes into account the dialogical nature of interactions online. And again, I'm saying dialogical and not deliberative. We can maybe go there later. But because there is a dialogue does not imply the statement of opinions without taking into account the rules of conversation or acknowledging the other, even only to disagree with them, right? So social media space is looking very fragmentary and poor if the definition of expression is so limited as to encompass exclusive verbalized opinions. Whereas in our approach, by including these non-verbalized opinions, such as activities, as well as text that doesn't necessarily contain an explicit political affiliation or political statement, we can paint a more accurate view of what political discussions online are about and how partisans interact with one another and negotiate arguments, but also identities.
Definitely. And I think it's hard to counter the argument we make if you think about protests, for example, right? Like, of course, a protest is a form of political expression, but it's not that everyone at the protest verbalizes their political opinion, right? Just being at the protest is the expression. And that is political. And
that's a typical form of expression that has been studied in non-digital political context. The same should be applied here. Another example from, again, the non-digital world is when people wear certain clothes or colors to symbolize a certain political position. For example, a rainbow color item like a bag or headband, wearing white, as we say in the paper, in the American Congress to signal a certain political affiliation, and so on and so forth. Or wearing a candidate button or wearing a poppy flower, and so on and so forth. These are non-verbalized but clearly political statements that are implicitly made by those who engage in this practice. And this is what I think our political expression definition captures better than the more limited verbalized opinion tradition.
Definitely. And I think, especially when it comes to wearing political buttons or t-shirts or bumper stickers, I mean, these are things that the classical political science literature counts as political participation. Yet, when it comes to studying online discourse, only that which carries a political opinion explicitly stated seems to count. And I think that's a bit of a disconnect.
And I think this is where we intervene and try to address that. And I believe the paper also demonstrates in its empirical methodological way that it is indeed working. For example, we look at the presence, let's say the behavior as presence of some political identified partisan in a specific counter-partisanal space to be meaningful as an act of political expression. But what I want to say that this is the starting point for discussing what does political expression online look like and making a corrective.
Definitely. And I'll use that to segue into the idea of cross-cutting because they're quite related, I think. And so cross-cutting is basically the idea that you see something that you disagree with. And there has been a lot of research focusing on what happens when people are exposed to political opinions they disagree with. What are the effects of that? And so this gets also to the idea of expression, I think, because there's so much research on cross-cutting exposure. So what happens after you're exposed to some information? So if you are a right-wing American, I know I will be using American examples most of the time, but because it's a two-party system, right, which makes it very easy to operationalize when something is cross-cutting. For example, if you are a right-wing conservative Republican and you see a news post or broadcast from a left-wing media outlet, say MSNBC, that would be a cross-cutting exposure. But the vast bulk of this research focus on exposure, not the act of expression.
So what's the difference? Would you like to elaborate a little bit?
It's a disconnect because it's not that democratic citizens are only consumers of information, right? They also produce political information in speech, through wearing buttons and bumper stickers, posting online. But the research overwhelmingly focuses on what happens when citizens see something they disagree with, not when they actually produce conversation, make a post, self-express. So the long story short, there is a lot of literature focused on what happens when people are exposed to information, but not so much research on people actually expressing, which is one of the things that social media allows for, right? It allows people to have a megaphone and have a larger voice in the public debate.
Indeed. And I think this is where the interesting part comes from our, again, theoretical point of view, because we kind of go against the grain saying we should expand political expression to include behavior. And then we go against the grain of majority of the existing research saying that cross-partisan interactions should be charted as well, not just exposure, but also when two ideologically motivated citizens interact with each other, do something, express themselves.
Yeah. And so this definitely conversations have been studied, but then it gets back to our point about opinions, right? That when conversations are studied between people who are on different sides of the political spectrum, scholars are usually focusing on the expression of opinion. And we're basically arguing that there's more than that going on. So just to kind of reset here, cross-cutting is when you see something that you disagree with. That is what the literature says. But I wanted to kind of go to the history of cross-cutting, which I think not so many people know, at least I didn't know until getting into this paper. And most people trace cross-cutting, rightly, back to the work of Diana Mutz in 2002, where she had a paper in APSR, the American Political Science Review, that essentially found that when people tend to engage in conversation with people who disagree with them, they are less likely to vote. And that was like a big deal, right? Like, oh my God, if people are being exposed to information they disagree with, are they less likely to vote? What does that mean for democracy? But Mutz herself took that concept from this idea of cross pressures. So cross-cutting was Mutz's reworking of cross pressures. And I want to just talk a little bit about cross pressures.
The genealogy.
The genealogy. I think it's quite interesting. So cross pressures is a concept developed by Lazarsfeld in his 1948 book, The People's Choice, How the Voter Makes Up His Mind in a Presidential Campaign. You can already tell it's a different time period, right, with a voter in his mind. But anyways, Lazarsfeld started with this idea of cross pressures, and it was a very popular concept, and it basically broke into two different models. So there's two theories of cross pressures. One is that the voter has competing identities, right? You may be a Republican, but you may also have, a certain level of income or a certain ethnicity, and these might basically compete.
This is actually very interesting also for multi-party systems where these various sides of yourself can have different times to express themselves in political choices.
Exactly. So the idea is that voters have different identity attachments and they compete and one is going to win out. And from political science, the argument is, well, we can model these identities and we can find out which one's the strongest. Is it your partisan loyalty? Is it your ethnicity? Is it your income? Is it your education? Blah, blah, blah. And so that's one idea of cross pressure that is called the additive model of social influence on partisan vote. That's one strain. The second strain, this is one that I find quite interesting. It's called the interaction effects model. And so the cross pressure here is that you have these competing identities and they compete so hard that you essentially enter a form of like existential despair. Like these identities weigh so much on you, you just say, forget it. I don't even want to deal with this anymore and I'm not going to vote. So like one example one can think of is, let's say you're a voter who supports generous welfare programs. That's a sort of democratic priority, but maybe you're also a pro-life evangelical, which would be more of a Republican priority. So then you have a moral dilemma between, do you help the poor by voting for the Democrats, or do you help the unborn by voting for Republicans? It's a little bit of an extreme example, but you can imagine how this voter might be unable to choose between the two and simply disengage from politics.
Again, this is a place where a lot of persuasion comes in, and issue salience for campaigning is also very important, because I think exactly that's the soft point or the soft part that campaigners are trying to reach. Basically convincing this voter with multiple identities that in this particular election, let's say welfare is much more important than the unborn for various reasons. And so that should be the salient issue and the identity that is activated, and the other one can be a latent one. And this could switch from election to election, even though we know that it's not always the case. We do know that there is an increase since the 2000s, if even not further back, of multi-fluctuating voters. Yeah, issues determine their allegiance more than political identities.
This is the kicker, though. These two research fields of cross pressures, these two ideas, right? One is that you have competing identities that you have to choose, and one is that these competing identities disengage you from politics because you can't choose. They've been studied for about 20 years after Lazarsfeld made these arguments, and there's little empirical support for either. So no model seems to actually hold up. But Mutz, in her 2002 study, she basically took this idea, these two different models of cross pressures, and worked them into cross-cutting, measured cross-cutting by asking people to pick through a phone survey. Think of someone you discuss politics with. How much do you disagree with that person? So through a series of survey items, long story short, cutting through a very dense APSR paper to basically argue that if people are conflict avoidant, if they don't like engaging in conflict, then when they encounter cross-cutting views, they will not vote. Because the argument that she makes is that, and we kind of think about it, it makes sense. If you value your social relationships more than your politics, then you may disengage from politics in order to keep your social relationships smooth.
There's a typical social psychology distinction between group-seeking and truth-seeking behavior, right?
Exactly. So she brings that in and makes this finding. And just one kind of cool part from the paper, she looks at different forms of participation, face-to-face versus not face-to-face. So you can get a sense of that. So for example, face-to-face would be working on a campaign, talking politics, and non-face-to-face or non-confrontational would be putting a sign in your yard or donating, right? Yeah. It's more of an anonymous behavior. So anyways, so she finds this dynamic, and that has kicked off a lot of research on cross-cutting exposure. There was a meta-analysis in 2019 by Jorg Mathis et al., and they looked at essentially every way you could look at this. Does cross-cutting exposure increase or decrease participation? Does it vary by the topic that's being discussed? Does it vary based on online or in-person? And long story short, just like the cross pressures literature, no consistent effect of cross-cutting exposure on online or offline participation, just full stop. So I just wanted to emphasize this idea of cross pressures. I think it's very interesting, going back to the 40s, thinking about how do we think about different identities in the context of political participation? So the point is, when you read about cross-cutting exposure, it has a history going back to the 40s that really Diana Mutz helped kick back into the literature with her finding that it decreases participation when you're exposed to counter-attitudinal views.
So with both, in a sense, both are theoretical, let's call innovation or novel propositions at least, hark back to an earlier non-digital era, going back to the 40s, going back maybe to the social movement literature in the case of political expression that argue for a broadened understanding of what these two respective concepts mean. And I think it's always useful to look back and update some of the present statements, right? But some things that we cannot go back so much to is Facebook, right? Like this is something that's truly very novel, and there's been a lot of discussion as to what is so new about Facebook, and are these Facebook pages the definition of political spaces? What type of political spaces? How, do you want to talk more about that aspect?
I do, but I think since following from cross-cutting, right, it's the idea that you're exposed to a different view. And then we say, all right, well, let's take that and let's say, how about people producing cross-cutting views? And in order to measure this on Facebook, we had to develop some way first to figure out what ideology or what side of the Brexit position people were on.
How did we do it? And again, it's a formula that you can find in the pages of the paper. But behind the formula, there's some thinking, and I think we can take this conversation as an opportunity to explicate a little bit more what is the thinking behind it. And it's a very simple and genius idea, which we should credit to our third co-author, Dutceac Bonacci from the University of Zagreb in Croatia, a computer scientist that really had a very elegant solution to our dilemma, how to identify or assign a certain position, a political identity or political leaning to the participants in our data. And so the idea was to take the political expression as behavior and operationalize it. And what is the behavior that we could capture in that rich data set prior to the Cambridge Analytica restrictions that Facebook offered us? Well, that was the liking and commenting. Yeah, right. Those were the two elements that we were able to use to identify the political leaning.
Yes, and I just want to, maybe for those who are not kind of getting their hands dirty so much with social media data, Facebook, before the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, allowed you to get all the posts that a page published as well as reactions to those posts. So you would get the number of likes, angries, these different reactions, which interestingly was a feature rolled out during our data. So we could kind of see the uptick of people using those. And they, long story short, they basically started using them very quickly, which was quite interesting. So you could get this reactions, and you could also get the content of comments. And I think that's important because no longer can you see that data. So the only reason we could do this is because of this data source that has since been removed, because in theory, you could go and put the comment into Facebook and find out who the person was who sent it. So there is a little bit of a personal data issue. Yeah.
But in our data is everything anonymized. So there is no issue with the data set we used. However, it enabled us to estimate what we want to emphasize, a content-free measure of ideological leaning. This is the important element. And that fits very nicely with what I was talking about before, the expression definition, right? So we don't do content analysis at this point in the paper in order to capture the leaning of the user's ideology. And this is, again, a different approach compared to a majority of the partisanship studies on social media that primarily looked at expressed opinions from which to infer political stance and from then political identities. Yeah. So our measure is content agnostic and relies instead on behavior, just as our political expression is. And the type of behavior that we capture are mainly two, likes and loves, and we direct those at the post level. So we don't capture affiliation by saying, if you are a pro-Brexit person, if you follow a pro-Brexit page, or you are a pro-Remainer if you follow the pro-Remain page in this campaign setting. We turn our attention to the data that was available to us for each post. So we knew which campaign made which post, and then we could see which user ID was connected to a like and a love. And we interpreted likes and loves to be supportive of that particular post. There's a whole discussion about the interpretation of reaction such as wow, haha, and so on. We did not want to engage with that because it's very problematic. So we only took the clear-cut like, and love. And we said, if a post is liked or loved by a user, this user gets a point in favor of that particular cause. So basically, our formula was trying to find a balance between the likes and loves given to the Brexit cause and the likes and love given to the Remain cause. And the formula you, of course, can read more specifically in the paper, but that's the logic of it. Looked at the post level and counted the proportion between pro-Brexit likes and loves and pro-Remain likes and loves.
It's literally just taking, did they like or love the Remain or Leave side more?
Essentially, but in a more nuanced way. And then we tested this just so that people listening to this would think, oh, this is so simple, does it really work? And then we did some qualitative verification and validation of this particular formula, and it does work. Yeah. It is a great approximation or inference of political affiliation.
I mean, if someone basically told me, if you just measured someone's Brexit attitude by counting the amounts of likes they made to a certain side, would that be an approximate? Would that be a valid measure? And I would say no. But then we went and we basically said, okay, here we have a bunch of pro-Leave users, here we have a bunch of pro-Remain users, let's look at the content of their comments. And they would just say, I'm voting this, I'm voting that. And they matched up in a very high number of cases.
And that is also a way to expand the number of users that got an affiliation. Had we only looked at follows, only very few people would have been able to be assigned an identity. Whereas like this, we were able to include those who engaged with the post. Of course, very few people really went both ways. Most people were internally consistent. They took a stance and followed it. So there were not a lot of people that had, let's say, out of 100 interactions, 80 with Brexit and 20 for Remain. They were much more consistent. So we were able to also kind of define this spectrum as being pretty clear, pro-Remain and pro-Brexit.
Yeah, the point of the formula was to give someone a score from -1 to 1 and try to capture these people who changed their minds. But
not so many people changed their minds.
We didn't even need to do a ratio because it was basically just people were either on one side or the other. And I think I think it's important to emphasize that for a user to be in this data set, and so we had about 350,000 users, about 2 million comments, they had to leave a comment, right? So that's already a certain type of person, one could argue. But the vast, vast majority of people in the data set only left 1, 2, perhaps even 3 comments. I think it was 85% of people left 3 or less. So the interesting part, and I think it's a shame that we don't have this type of data anymore, is that even though to be in the data set, someone had to comment, someone may have left 1 comment, but reacted 100 times.
Which is a typical social media behavior we know from all sorts of walks of life outside politics.
Right. So it doesn't quite capture these lurkers who never post because they had to post once to be in the data set. But focusing on reactions did give us a measure of people who leave a expression, a behavior.
Which is exactly what I was going to say, that they were the only tipping point in their mobilization, if you wish, is to have mobilized once during the space of 10 weeks before the campaign, 10 weeks of the campaign, and
30 weeks in total.
10 weeks after the campaign, right? So we definitely were able to get at the low mobilization type of potential voter.
Which brings in the question of what is a Facebook page?
Exactly. What were they reacting to?
I think it's interesting because, and something that we thought a lot about in this paper, like what is actually a Facebook page? Because there's sort of a idea or the connotation is that a Facebook page is kind of this stable thing.
It's a web page, but on Facebook.
Yeah, like you go to the page of this politician or this party or this brand, company, whatever, and it's stable, right? And it is. You can go and search and go like a website. You could go to a Facebook page. In reality, though, people, they subscribe to a page, they like it, they follow it, but the way that they actually experience the page is on their feed as a single post. Sometimes you like a page and you never see content from it. sometimes you don't follow a page and you get exposed to it because someone shares it.
And that's the beauty. I wanted to emphasize this aspect of the Facebook structure, which is important when we discuss and maybe is not apparent immediately. The fact that Facebook pages are rarely visited as a homepage. The function of a Facebook page follow, so the reason why anyone would follow or like a Facebook page is to make sure that it is included in their feed. It's a signal that they want to get updates from that page from then onwards. It's not necessarily a consultation of static content, but it is a signal that they want to continue to be prompted with information, updated information from that particular Facebook page. That's an important distinguishing feature with traditional homepages.
And so we don't have that information of who subscribed and who didn't. But the fact that the vast majority of people left one comment seems to suggest to me, and we can't show this in the data, but it seems to suggest that they may not be following the page and are just exposed somehow on their feed. They see one post, they leave a comment, they may never see anything about Brexit again, right? We don't know. But there's a small number of people who are highly engaged in the referendum and the online conversation, and they're probably going to the page, searching it on Facebook, going to the page like a website, and just commenting on everything. And those would be our super participants, exactly. Right? So I think that is, it's worth thinking about. The users on Facebook that we're studying, I think the vast majority of them just see a post here and there on their feed. And then there's a small number who are really going into the other page and trolling and arguing and all sorts of things.
Also, I may say the Facebook algorithm, as opaque as it was then and continues to be, rewards or interprets as signal of further reinforcement every time you interact with a post from that particular page.
Right, so there could be a reinforcing effect.
Exactly, which is interesting and something that, again, we couldn't tell, but maybe the one-time or two-time commentators in our data were those who were incidentally exposed to content from the pro-Brexit or the pro-Remain campaigns, whereas the other ones were more getting them regularly as subscribers. We don't know that. We don't know how exactly the mechanisms would work, and that's another trove of information that researchers unfortunately don't have access to, so we can only speculate. Regardless, the dynamic nature, as we write in the paper, of Facebook interactions is basically, to some extent, better captured if we define political expression and cross-cutting interactions in this dynamic, non-content-driven way.
And I think it was important to reflect a bit. What is actually a Facebook page? I think we kind of take it for granted. They used to be fan pages, now public pages. And they're just not as static as I think we tend to think about them when we first hear the word page. It's actually this ephemeral construct that pops up in some feeds and not others.
If I might add one more element to this before moving on, is the idea that Facebook, and this is a contribution I think our findings will also relate to, many previous Polcom research has focused on Facebook pages as arenas of intra-partisan interaction, exactly like a homepage, like a base for a certain ideology. So
a fan page.
A fan page, exactly. Like this is where all the Swifties gather. Well, instead of, following an artist, you can follow a political idea or politician and so on and so forth. But the idea would be that Facebook pages are associated with one specific political agenda, one specific ideology, one specific agenda point or issue, if that's their nature. And this is where I think our approach can also contribute with a more diverse explanation of how Facebook pages really operate, the functions of Facebook pages.
It's worth thinking about, that's for sure. And I think in general, just thinking about, what is the kind of space that you're studying is important to give the appropriate context as to what might be the behaviors that are occurring there. So I want to briefly touch upon topic models, right? Because we do some topic models on the content of the comments themselves as a way to get a sense of what are the topics that people are discussing in the Brexit debate. And in particular, one of the things that was interesting is that we found a lot of what could be called spam, but we call chain comments in the paper because spam has a very specific meaning in the sort of informatics, computer science literature, which is Spam tends to have a hyperlink, and it tends to be a way of social engineering, or it's basically junk. And we basically didn't want to put this connotation of spam being junk, because a lot of these spam posts had very sort of valid information in them. Lists of, here's a bunch of companies that pulled out of the UK and are outsourcing their work elsewhere.
10 reasons to vote X.
So many of them. And we ended up basically estimating about 3% of the comments were spam. But if you know a little bit about topic models, basically what topic models do is they compare, whether it's news articles or speeches, they compare how words are distributed across different documents as a way to present, here are the main topics that are in this massive text. How words cluster. So if you have a high number of repetitive posts that are copy-pasted, the topic model is going to basically say, this is a topic. It's sort of cheating the way topic models work. It's not giving us the true representation of topics. It's giving us what is the most spam.
Also because the authors of these chain comments were very careful to not be detected by the algorithms put in place by Facebook to avoid this kind of behavior, or always superficially modifying the characters in their comments so that they cannot be deduplicated.
They would do things like they'd have 10 periods before they would copy paste, and then they'd have 9 periods before they copy paste. But it's interesting that this was really a challenge in terms of topic modeling a bunch of Facebook comments, because we would just get topics that were basically spam posts. So we had to go through those, and we kind of dealt with that by basically detecting the spam, and we did a lot of human coding. And this is the point I wanted to make about topic models, and this was a big fight we had with reviewers, was after doing tons and tons of different topic models, we basically came at a final number, an optimal K number of 43 topics, right? So we asked the model, give us 43 topics in this data set, of which we only found, after looking at these ourselves, that about 29 we could keep. So 29 were made sense to us. They were very coherent. We kept those. So we kept 29 out of 43. And here's the point I want to make about topic models. There is a norm or an understanding with topic models, an idea that a good topic model has to be one where the number of topics you request, most of those should be interpretable. So the reviewer was basically saying, well, you asked for 43 topics, but you only kept 29. That means your model isn't good. And I just wanted to point out for the listeners that I don't think this is true. I don't think when you're dealing with data like Facebook comments or any type of social media data, that there is necessarily an optimal number of topics out there. It's a question to be had, but I'm not sure that the measure of a good topic model is how close your requested number gets to the number of interpretable topics, because I'm not sure that all data sets have a ground truth number of real topics. What do you think?
I don't think so, because again, the way we collected the data we had access to was also very, in a sense, spontaneous and contextual, and the events that generated comments were also very unique. For example, a particular interview or a television discussion between pro and against EU politicians and so on, or specific scandals like the killing of a British politician that appears as a comet-like presence, brightens up the conversation, but then dies out very quickly. So was this a topic? Of course, people commented quite a lot. They expressed sympathies. They tried to make sense of it. They tried to speculate about the consequence of this. But it wasn't a topic in the sense that it carried over the 30-week span we covered. It was only a hot focal point for a short period of time. And so the topic models that would include us as a topic would be slightly misleading, even though it was indeed a temporary topic.
Yeah. Fundamentally, I mean, topic models are one of the primary ways to torture data and make something appear as if it's there. So for example, just briefly, we had, just looking at the top words of some topics were things like, that seemed to indicate a sort of racist cluster. And then you actually go look at the comments that were associated with it, had nothing to do with race, even though the top words were. So I don't know.
I think it's a good way to get a first-hand view of scan an unknown data set, but a paper based exclusively on topic models doesn't say too much.
Yeah, let me contextualize. When it comes to the absolute messiness of Facebook comments, where you could tell people had been drinking, right? You can look up and see the timestamps and Friday, Saturday night. I mean, some of these comments are completely incoherent. So it's a bit tougher than if you're looking at parliamentary debates where that have been, professionally typed out. But anyways, that's a little bit about topic models. Definitely put a lot of work into the supplementary material, so that whole process is detailed. So at least, even with a bit of skepticism, you can see exactly how that was done. But why don't we basically talk about what the output of those topic models were and what we were actually looking at. So we were looking at topics and we were looking at arguments.
So what were these people talking about when they were talking to each other, like across partisan lines, and when they were talking to same partisan group? Because we also wanted to capture, again, this is the gist of the paper. The reason why we tortured the data to obtain the topic models was to obtain or test the idea that there is a different nature of the conversations that take place in like-minded comments and in cross-cutting comments. That is the motivation to perform these topic models. And the idea was to capture whether there are certain ideas that are connected to inwards-looking discussions and other ideas that are promoted when the two partisans would interact with one another.
And the irony is, it's not so much in the content of the expression of engaging in cross-cutting, it's the fact that cross-cutting seems to have an effect on the Remain page.
Exactly. And this is basically what goes back to our idea of expression, which is my motto throughout this particular conversation, that the content is interesting, but what is more interesting is the behavior, in a sense, the repercussions that political expression, both as verbalized speech and as behavior being present on a specific Facebook page, this is what creates a certain effect, what we can detect in our data. So I think it's interesting to draw the attention of the listeners to our topic distribution. Was there something that people talked to each other when they were cross-cutting, when they were meeting each other on grounds that are not their own?
And of course they were. So if you look at this figure 5 in the paper, I mean, when people engage in cross-cutting discussions, they're talking about substantial issues, right? They're talking about the fundamental democratic nature of the EU. Is it democratic or not? Or is it unelected bureaucrats? They're talking about trade. They're talking about industry. But the interesting part is that because you had so many Brexiteers going over into the Remain page, there's literally no topic that Remainers could discuss amongst themselves.
That's interesting. So looking at the cross-cutting, we find the expected talking points, the controversial points about the nature of EU collaboration. But looking at the intra-partisan discussions, we see that the pro-Brexit users could develop unique topics of conversation, whereas the Remainers could not. And in a sense, both you and I agree, this is probably the most interesting finding and something that we did not necessarily expect at the beginning of the paper.
No, not at all. So the interesting part, and I mean, we have descriptions of all the topics in the appendix because a lot of people are interested in Brexit. I think we're interested more in what Brexit can tell us about these behaviors. And so what we find is that when you have this one-sided cross-cutting expression, which is you have tons of Brexiteers going over into the Remain page, Remainers cannot talk about anything without the Brexiteers coming in and blowing up the conversation. And we see that in things like Zoom bombing, Twitch raiding. Basically, we're making the argument that this same dynamic of blowing up a political opponent's conversation can happen, and it can happen without explicitly stating your political opinion, right? It can happen just by flooding the page, which is what we saw from the Brexiteers going to the Remainers. Whereas if you look at the other way around, even though there were lots of Remainers that did express a cross-cutting comment into the Brexit page, they weren't able to do it at the same scale. And what that means is that the Brexiteers had a lot of chance to discuss topics amongst themselves. And those were things like all sorts of stuff. I mean, Bilderberg conspiracy, talking about what was happening on TV, who should be the next prime minister. But we also find, and I think this is an interesting part of the paper, that when a page has the chance to build a community within it, we can find examples of political mobilization.
And that's one of the interesting functions that a Facebook page can carry. And that's maybe what people would expect them to have as this type of cheering you on and giving community support and building a feeling of a joint political identity, a joint political agenda. And this is what the pro-Brexit users were able to build.
They, for example, told one another about how to register, when to register. They reminded each other very, very often of the voting day, right? But they also took very concrete actions, like bringing a black pen to the voting booth. That was one of the mobilization clusters we found. And another one was the government mailed a leaflet to every household in the UK, basically saying, we think you should vote Remain. And the Brexiteers coordinated in the Facebook page to send those leaflets back as a protest. So maybe not the most important form of political mobilization, but I think together it shows that in the absence of cross-cutting expression, and this is kind of the interesting twist, you can find examples of political mobilization. And it may be the case that the Remain page just didn't have that opportunity because so many Brexiteers were expressing themselves in a cross-cutting space.
Of course, there's some offline reasons also beyond this. The fact that the pro-Brexit users have been kind of pumped up over a longer period of time. They had already built an anti-EU, a Eurosceptic attitude for a longer period of time. Their political identity was more sedimented, if you wish, whereas the Remainers were kind of a bunch of different people that now were united in their support of the continuous membership of the EU, even though they otherwise may not have seen eye to eye politically. So that obviously explains to some extent the behavior, but certainly the concerted action of these cross-cutting commentators is clearly visible in the type of content that was able to be generated in the two pages. Maybe now it's also a good point a good timestamp to talk about another dimension of the content that we also took into account, which is the arguments. Very briefly, we looked at what they were talking about in terms of topics, but we also wanted to test this idea that is sedimented in deliberative theory, namely that when two sides meet, this is when the opportunity for rational arguments emerge. And we did expect indeed that cross-cutting comments would be more likely to be associated with arguments. And again, this is where maybe there is one word to add in terms of the theoretical definition of what an argument is. We basically scaled down the high ideal of deliberation standards applied to typical political settings such as parliamentary debates to the social media setting involving regular citizens. So it is highly unrealistic to have a full deliberative conversation fulfilling 7 criteria or 5 criteria that have been developed in the philosophically oriented literature. We decided to scale down this and simply use the criterion of the need for rational backup, the need for an explanation, and the desire to engage in some form of evidence provision as elements of the argument. So we basically said, how can we code for an argument? When we did this by hand, looking at 5,000 comments, well, it needed to be about the topic. So we excluded stuff that was completely irrelevant. We then looked whether the comment contained any kind of reason, like a because. And then we also looked if the reason was followed by evidence. And let it again be very clear, we did not evaluate the quality of that evidence. The evidence could be entirely opinionated, non-factual. We did not check that. We only wanted to see if the logic of argumentation was present. And a small number of arguments were made in this entire conversation, and that these arguments were highly correlated with cross-cutting comments.
For me, the main takeaway of the arguments is that we find there's 7% of the comments. So 7% of these comments have arguments, but then we, by our cross-cutting expression measure, looking at likes, we find that 29% of the comments are cross-cutting. So there's a difference between 7% measured at this content level and 29% measured at this expression level. And they're not the same thing, but what it does signal, and we talk about this in the paper, is there may be a risk for going through an online data set and trying to understand where are the opinions and what's the quality of the discussion, because you're only looking at a small slice. And I think, just to maybe go back to the initial discussion that we opened with, is that I think we need to have a broader understanding of expression when it comes to social media data. What is politics on social media? It's more than verbalized opinions. And I think one of the things I'm very interested to see is, as the social media platforms continue to diversify, they continue to grow in number, there's going to be forms of expression that we can't anticipate. And who knows with AR and VR. So I think keeping this narrow vision of the only thing that matters is deliberation, or we need people to verbalize their political expressions to be counted in academic research, I think is a bit short-sighted.
Yes, I agree. And I think that, of course, there's more nuance now in the deliberation literature. But I think overall, nuancing and adapting the standards of what counts as propitious for democracy needs to be kind of contextualized. And I think our paper is one element to buttress that point. The paper is open access, so indeed, anyone who has a curiosity to dig more systematically into what we have looked at in this conversation has the opportunity to do so. Check out the supplementary material where a lot of examples are given. For example, what is a political argument? We could give some examples of that. What exactly are words associated with a given topic, like send back the leaflet and stuff like this, that without knowing too much about Brexit doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah, so there will be a link in the episode description. There is online code and anonymized data if you want to replicate the figures. But Dr. Dutceac, Segesten, thanks so much for coming on and helping contextualize for listeners what's going on with cross-cutting expression on social media.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Anamaria Dutceac Segesten, Associate Professor of Strategic Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can find a link to the paper in the episode description. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Professor Alex Kopic from Yale University about political persuasion and the efficacy of online ads. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Elmo. See you next time.